A woman is pushed onto an auction platform in broad daylight, not livestock, not land, but a human being, while the entire town watches and no one dares to speak up. This is the story of Ilara Quinn, robbed of everything, sold like property, but chooses to rise up and burn the very system that crushed her. Press like to support the channel, comment the name of the city you're watching so I know how far this story has come, and don't leave, because the best part is yet to come. The auction block in Black Hollow was made from the same timber as the gallows, and most people in town figured that was no accident. It stood at the far end of Meridian Street, where the road widened enough for wagons to turn around and where the packed dirt had been stained dark over the years from things that didn't bear naming. In the early days, the block had been used for livestock sales, horses, mules, the occasional small herd of cattle that some desperate homesteader was unloading before winter hit and the cost of feeding them became impossible. That was the story most people told themselves about the thing, that it was just a platform, just wood, just a practical piece of frontier infrastructure with no meaning beyond the practical. But that was before Vern Harlow came to Black Hollow. The morning Ilara Quinn was brought to the block, the temperature had already climbed past 90 before 8 o'clock. The sky was the color of bone, bleached and featureless, and the sun sat in it like a brand that hadn't cooled. Flies worked the air in lazy spirals. The smell of horse dung and unwashed bodies and the sour undertone of fear hung over Meridian Street the way smoke hangs over a fire. Low, clinging, inescapable. She was brought in on foot, her wrists bound in front of her with a length of rope that had been pulled tight enough to leave marks. Two of Harlow's men flanked her, big men in matching dark vests that had been stitched with a small cattle brand emblem on the breast pocket. Harlow's mark, the double H that everyone in the territory had come to recognize the way they recognized a skull on a bottle of poison. The men didn't touch her. They didn't need to. The rope did the talking, and the crowd that had gathered along both sides of the street said the rest with their silence. Ilara walked with her chin up. That was the first thing people noticed. Not the rope, not the two hired men, not even the bruise that sat like a shadow below her left eye. They noticed that she didn't look down. Her eyes moved across the crowd steadily, deliberately, the way a person reads a page they're trying to memorize. She was 24 years old. Her dark hair had come loose from whatever she'd tied it back with, and it fell across one shoulder in a way that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with the fact that no one had given her a moment to put herself together. Her dress was the same one she'd been wearing when they dragged her out of what was left of the Quinn ranch house 2 days ago. The hem was filthy. The left sleeve had been torn somewhere above the elbow and hung in a way that bothered her. She kept trying to push it back, which was difficult with her hands tied, which was the sort of small indignity that sits on top of a catastrophe and makes the catastrophe somehow worse. The crowd watched her walk. Nobody cheered. Nobody heckled. Nobody did anything, which was in some ways the worst of all the options available to them. A town that hollers at a cruelty is at least a town that knows what it's seeing. A town that goes silent has already made its calculation and decided it doesn't want to be part of what comes next. Black Hollow had made that calculation a while ago. The man running the auction was a thin, pale figure named Doyle, Harlow's accountant, officially, though the word accountant in this context was doing a great deal of work. He wore a black hat and a black coat in the brutal heat and somehow didn't seem to sweat. He had a ledger tucked under one arm and a voice that carried without effort, which was a talent he'd clearly cultivated because it was one of the few things he had that was actually useful. "Ladies and gentlemen," Doyle said, and the words dripped with the kind of professional pleasantry that has nothing to do with pleasure, "we are gathered here this morning to settle a matter of outstanding debt." He opened the ledger. He had a habit of consulting it even when he didn't need to. It was theater, and he knew it, but theater has its uses. The Quinn property, some 460 acres on the eastern tributary, improvements included, was transferred into the rightful possession of the Harlow Land and Cattle Company 3 days ago, pursuant to the enforcement of a loan agreement signed in good faith by the late Thomas Quinn. He let that sit for a moment. The transfer is recorded and legal. What we are addressing today is the matter of the daughter, who by the terms of the same agreement is considered an asset of the estate. Ilara, standing on the block, turned her head and looked at Doyle. The look didn't have anger in it. It had something colder and more dangerous than anger. the particular focus of someone who is committing every detail of a moment to memory for future use. "She's not an asset," said a woman in the crowd. Her name was May Cutler, and she ran the dry goods store on the corner of Meridian and 3rd. And the fact that she was the only person in that crowd who said a word out loud was the kind of detail Ilara filed away alongside the rest. One of Harlow's men looked at May Cutler, just looked at her. May's mouth closed. "Bidding will commence at $50, Doyle said, as if nothing had happened. The bidding that followed was ugly in the way that small corruptions are ugly. Not spectacular, not even particularly dramatic, just mean and grinding and thoroughly ordinary. A man near the back called out 60. Another one said 75. The first man came back with 80. There was a pause. The second man said 90, and then seemed to think about it, and then said 100 to put the question to rest. A murmur went through the crowd, the kind of murmur that is less about surprise and more about a group of people absorbing the fact that something is happening that all of them know is wrong and none of them are doing anything about. Ilara stood on the block and breathed slowly. The rope on her wrists was burning where the knot sat against the inside of her left wrist. She focused on that, the specific, physical fact of it, because it was something she could manage when the rest of it was too large to hold. Her father had died 6 weeks ago. Pneumonia, complicated by a heart that had been wearing out for years. He had not died well, which was another thing she was adding to the list of things that belonged to Vern Harlow. Thomas Quinn had spent his last weeks convinced that the loan documents Harlow's people had brought him were straightforward, that the terms were what they'd been told they were, that the interest rate was the one they'd discussed, and not a different one printed in smaller text on the 3rd page. He'd signed the papers on a Tuesday afternoon with his reading glasses on, and his hand still shaking from fever, and Ilara standing beside him trying to read over his shoulder while one of Harlow's lawyers explained in a very calm voice that everything was in order. She had not trusted that calm voice. She had said so. Thomas Quinn had told her she was too suspicious of people, that not everyone in the world was trying to take something from you, that Harlow was a hard man, but he was a businessman, and a deal was a deal. Thomas Quinn had been wrong about a number of things in his life, but that one had cost them everything. 110, said someone new, and Ilara looked up. He was standing at the outer edge of the crowd, in the narrow gap between the hardware store and the building next to it that had been empty for 2 years, and was starting to list noticeably to the left. He was tall enough that she could see him over the heads of the people in front of him. He wore a dark hat with a dented crown and a coat that had been brown once and had been weathered into something closer to the color of old wood. He had a rifle slung across his back on a worn leather strap, and 2 revolvers on his hips, which was not in itself unusual in Black Hollow. Most men wore at least 1 gun, and a significant number wore 2, but the way he wore them was different. They sat on him the way tools sit on a man who uses them regularly and professionally, without display, without self-consciousness, with a kind of quiet practicality that was somehow more unsettling than anything showy would have been. The crowd moved. Not a lot, just enough. The way a group of people unconsciously adjusts its arrangement when someone enters a space who changes the weight of the room. Doyle looked up from his ledger. Something shifted in his expression. Not fear exactly, but the particular alertness of a man who has just heard a sound he wasn't expecting. "The bid is 110, he said, after a pause. "Do I have 120? The man who'd bid 100 said quietly that he was done. The other bidder said nothing. 110 going once, Doyle said. His voice had lost some of its professional ease. Going twice! The new bidder said nothing. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at Doyle with an expression that was somewhere between patience and boredom, which was an expression that had probably served him well in negotiations before. "Sold," Doyle said, "for $110 to—" He hesitated because he knew the name and didn't want to say it and was going to have to say it anyway. "To Mr. Maddox." The name went through the crowd like a current, not loudly. There was no collective gasp, no theatrical reaction, but you could feel it the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. People who had been leaning in leaned back. People who had been watching the block started watching the man at the edge of the crowd instead. Rhett Maddox. There were stories about Rhett Maddox the way there were stories about dangerous weather, specific, numerous, and mostly exaggerated, but exaggerated in ways that pointed at something real underneath. He'd ridden with a mercenary outfit in the wars over water rights down south, or he'd been hired to clear squatters off land that turned out to belong to the squatters, or he'd once held a man at gunpoint for 6 hours over a matter of principle, or the matter of principle was actually $30 and a horse, depending on who was telling it. The number of men he'd killed varied so wildly across tellings that it had become essentially a joke. Some people said 6, some said 20. One particularly drunk man at the Hollow's Only Saloon had once claimed the number was over 50, which even the drunk man seemed to recognize was probably an overstatement. What was consistent across all the versions was this: Rhett Maddox was a man that other men got careful around, not because he was loud about it, but because he wasn't. He walked through the crowd now, and the crowd let him through, and he climbed the 3 steps to the auction block with the unhurried deliberateness of a man who has decided what he's going to do and is in the process of doing it. He was closer to 40 than to 30, with a face that had been worked over thoroughly by weather and time. Not ugly, but marked, with lines around his eyes that came from squinting into the sun and a jaw that had probably been broken at least once based on the way it sat slightly asymmetrical. He was not what you'd call a handsome man. He was the kind of man you noticed because of the way he moved through space, as if the space around him made adjustments. He stood on the block in front of Ilara. She was not a short woman, 5'6", with the rancher's posture of someone who spent years in the saddle, but he had several inches on her, and she had to tilt her head back slightly to meet his eyes. She did not look away. Neither did he. He reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of paper, which he held out to Doyle without looking at him. "Receipt," he said. Doyle took it with the stiff movements of a man trying to appear less uncomfortable than he was. Maddox turned back to Ilara. He studied her face for a moment, not in a way that had appetite in it, but in the way you look at a problem you're trying to understand. Then he reached into his coat again and brought out a knife. The crowd tensed. Someone made a small sound. He cut her bindings. One clean stroke and the rope fell away from her wrists. She brought her hands up in front of her and looked at them. The marks where the rope had sat, the line of raw skin around her left wrist where the knot had pressed. She rubbed her right thumb across the inside of her wrist slowly. The pain was real and specific and grounding. "You can go," Maddox said. She looked up. "Walk away," he said. "Right now. Nobody in this crowd's going to stop you." He said it plainly, without particular emphasis, which made it more convincing rather than less. "Or you can ride with me. Your choice." A pause. "You've got about 30 seconds to decide, because Harlow's going to hear about this inside of an hour, and it'd be better for both of us if we weren't in this town when he does." The crowd was so quiet you could hear the flies. Ilara looked out at Meridian Street. She looked at May Cutler, who had said one sentence and then fallen silent. She looked at the auction block's worn wood under her boots, the same wood as the gallows. She looked at Doyle, who was studying his ledger with the focused attention of a man pretending he'd rather be somewhere else. She looked at Rhett Maddox. "You know who those men are," she said. "The ones who took my father's land." "I know who they work for," he said. "Do you know why you know that?" He looked at her steadily. "That's a conversation for later." "You can't tell me now." "I can tell you it's not a short conversation," he said. "And I can tell you we're standing in the wrong place for it." She stepped down from the block. Her legs were shakier than she wanted them to be. She'd been standing in the sun since before sunrise, and she hadn't eaten since yesterday morning, and the adrenaline that had been holding her upright was starting to metabolize into something less useful. But she kept her spine straight and her chin level, and she walked toward the steps without reaching for the railing. "Where are the horses?" she said. "Behind the hardware store." She walked off the block and through the crowd without looking at anyone, and the crowd parted for her, and Rhett Maddox came down the steps behind her, and neither of them looked back. Behind the hardware store, there were 2 horses. One was a big roan gelding with a white blaze and a temperament that suggested he'd been ridden hard and often and had come to terms with it. The other was a smaller buckskin mare, saddled and equipped with a pair of saddlebags that Ilara noticed had been packed for travel. 2 sets, she realized, which meant he'd come prepared for this particular outcome, which meant several things, and she wasn't sure which of those things she wanted to examine first. "You expected me," she said. He was untying the roan's reins from the hitching post behind the building. I expected someone was going to come out of that auction needing a horse. You just happen to have two. I've been in this territory for 3 weeks, he said. I've been watching how Harlow does things. Auctions are common. He said it flatly, without editorializing, which was somehow worse. Mount up. We'll talk once we're moving. She swung up onto the buckskin without assistance, which he hadn't offered. The mare shifted slightly and steadied. Alara found the stirrups, found her seat, and let her hands settle on the reins with the muscle memory of someone who has ridden since before she could read. The pain in her wrists made the grip uncomfortable. She adjusted and made it work. They rode out of Black Hollow on the back road that ran parallel to Meridian Street before curving north, away from the main trail. It was a road that people used when they didn't want to be seen leaving town, which meant it had more traffic than you'd expect from its condition. The ruts were deep, and the scrub on both sides had been pushed back by repeated passage. Maddox rode slightly ahead, not because he was leading in any declarative sense, but because he knew the road and she didn't. She let him. The town fell behind them. The bone-pale sky stretched ahead. The sound of flies and crowd murmur gave way to the creak of leather and the steady percussion of hooves, and behind them the occasional distant sound of Black Hollow continuing its business without them. Start talking, Alara said. He glanced back at her. The loan documents your father signed were fraudulent. Were altered, he said. There's a difference legally. Altered means there's paper somewhere that shows what they looked like before, if you know where to look. Fraudulent means you built something from nothing. Altered is actually easier to prove. She absorbed this. You've seen them. I've seen the originals. He turned back to the road ahead. The copies Harlow's lawyer showed your father had different terms, but the originals, the ones that were filed first, before Harlow's people got to the land office, those tell a different story. She felt something shift in her chest that was not quite hope, because hope was a word she was being careful with, but was in the same territory. Where? Land office in Carver's Bluff, he said. About 40 miles east. We'd be there in 2 days on good roads. A pause. These aren't good roads. How do you know about the originals? He didn't answer right away. The road bent north around a long outcropping of pale rock, and the shade it threw was brief and welcome and gone almost before they were in it. When the sun hit them again, it hit with the full weight of midday, and Alara felt it on the back of her neck like a hand pressing down. I had a brother, Maddox said, past tense. She noted it and said nothing. He ran a small operation about 60 miles west of Black Hollow. 50 acres, decent water, nothing impressive. Harlow wanted it for the water rights. He said it all in the same tone he'd said everything else. Level, uninflected, like he was recounting logistics rather than history, which was a tone she recognized as something a person builds when they've said the same thing a number of times, and have had to find a way to say it that doesn't take them apart. 2 years ago, Harlow's lawyers showed up with loan documents. My brother said he'd never taken a loan from Harlow. They said he had, and they had paper proving it. 6 weeks later, my brother's land was Harlow's, and my brother was... He stopped. He's not working that land anymore. I'm sorry, Alara said. He didn't respond to that. Not dismissively. Just in the way of someone who doesn't know what to do with the words and has decided to let them sit. So you've been watching Harlow, she said. For 2 years. Alone? For the most part. She looked at the road ahead. The scrub on either side was thinning as they moved north, giving way to tougher, drier vegetation, the kind that survived out here by having no illusions about what the land was offering. Flat-topped buttes rose in the middle distance, rust-colored in the afternoon light, their edges sharp against the pale sky. My father's land has a water source, she said. The eastern tributary. Harlow wants that. He wants everything, Maddox said. The water's part of it, but the Quinn property connects 2 pieces of land he's already acquired on either side. He needs it to consolidate. Without it, his holdings in that area are split, and he can't run the cattle operation he's planning. He killed my father for a cattle operation. The word killed sat there between them, and Maddox didn't correct it. He accelerated what was already happening, he said, which was a careful distinction, and Alara decided not to argue it right now. There would be time for that argument. Those land office documents in Carver's Bluff, she said. If we can get to them. We can make a case, he said. But a case needs somewhere to go. A judge, a marshal, someone with enough authority to act on it who isn't already in Harlow's pocket. He said it without bitterness, just accuracy. That's the harder part. How many judges are in Harlow's pocket? He thought about it. Of the 3 who cover this territory, 2 for certain. The third is unclear. He paused. There's a federal marshal out of Carson Wells who hasn't had any dealings with Harlow yet. At least not that I found evidence of. That's not the same as knowing he's clean. No, Maddox agreed. It isn't. The afternoon wore on. They rode without much conversation for a stretch, which was comfortable in the way that silences are comfortable between people who are both thinking about the same problem and have agreed, without saying so, to think about it separately before talking. The buckskin mare had an easy gait, and Alara settled into it, letting her body find the rhythm the way it always had. The particular kind of body memory that goes deep enough that pain and exhaustion don't reach it. They stopped at a dry creek bed around 3 in the afternoon to let the horses rest. There was a scrubby willow growing in the creek's former channel, dead but still standing, its branches casting a lacy, inadequate shade. Maddox gave the horses water from a skin he'd packed, not enough to satisfy them fully, just enough to maintain. And Alara sat with her back against a pale sandstone boulder and ate hardtack from the saddlebag he'd pointed her toward without comment, which she took as permission rather than an offering, because the distinction seemed important to maintain. "How did you know who I was?" she asked. He was standing near the horses, his back to her, scanning the flat country in the direction they'd come from. The habit of it was automatic and thorough. A sweep from left to right, a pause, a focus on the middle distance, then left again. She recognized the pattern as something practiced over years. "Talk to people in town," he said. "Before the auction. May Cutler, at the dry goods store." "May," Alara said. "She told me about your father's land, the circumstances. The auction was already scheduled by then. Harlow doesn't waste time once he's moving." He glanced back at her briefly. "She was worried about you." "She didn't do anything." "No," he said, with nothing additional. Not judgment, not defense, just confirmation. Alara turned the hardtack over in her hands. It was unpleasant food under any circumstances, and particularly unpleasant when you haven't eaten properly in 2 days, but it was better than the alternative. "The men Harlow sent after us," she said. "When's that starting?" "Doyle will send a rider to Harlow's main operation. That's about 12 miles south of Black Hollow. Big spread. You'd have seen it from the road coming into town." He turned back to his surveying. "Harlow will have men moving within an hour of getting the news, probably less. He doesn't like loose ends." "Are we loose ends?" "You're a witness to the fraud on your father's property," he said. "And I've been asking questions in his territory for 3 weeks. Yes." He turned then and looked at her directly. "We're loose ends." She nodded, ate the hardtack, thought about water, which she was trying not to think about too specifically because there wasn't enough of it, and thinking about it specifically made the shortage more acute. The sun was dropping toward the western buttes now, the light going amber and thick and, theoretically, beautiful, though beauty was not high on her list of current priorities. "The water," she said. "How much do we have?" "Enough for tonight," he said. "There's a spring about 5 miles north that I used on the way in. We can refill there." "You mapped this route coming in." "I try to know the ground I might need to move over," he said. "That's the sort of thing a man does when he's planning something." He turned his head to look at her. There was something in his expression that might have been the beginning of something dry and amused, though it didn't fully arrive. "You're quick," he said. "I grew up on a working ranch," she said. "You learn to notice things or you don't last." He turned back to the horizon. "We should move soon." She stood, and the blood moved back into her legs with an unpleasant rush that she absorbed without commentary. She put the remaining hardtack in her coat pocket for later and walked back to the buckskin, and mounted with the same clean efficiency as before. They rode north. The spring he'd mentioned materialized in the long blue hour before dark, a seep in the base of a rock formation, modest and reliable looking, with the characteristic ring of tougher grass that marked water in dry country. The horses drank with the concentrated focus of animals making up for a deficit, and Alara filled the water skins and drank in long, careful swallows that she kept measured because drinking too fast after a deficit was its own problem. Maddox made a small fire, which he built with the practice minimum necessary, enough for warmth, small enough to be difficult to spot at distance. He made coffee from the pack, real coffee, which Alara had not expected and which, in the specific context of the past 2 days, was close enough to a kindness that she let herself register it. She took the cup he handed her and sat across the fire from him and said, "Tell me about your brother." He looked at her across the fire. The light moved on his face in the way firelight does, giving it dimension and animation, making the lines more pronounced, making him look older, and then, in the next moment's flicker, something else. "He was younger," he said, "by 8 years, named Ben." He turned the tin cup in his hands. He had no sense about people. Thought everyone was operating in good faith until the evidence was overwhelming, and sometimes not even then. He paused. "I used to think it was a deficiency. Turned out it was just—" He stopped again, started differently. He kept good records, meticulous. Every transaction, every agreement, every conversation of consequence written down. He thought the world made sense if you kept good enough records of it. "Do you have his records?" "I have everything he left." Alara looked at the fire. "When you say he's not working the land anymore, he's in the state hospital in Dunmore," Maddox said. "He had the circumstances of losing the land broke something in him. He's not—" He stopped. The cup turned in his hands again, once, twice. "He's there, and he doesn't know I'm here. He doesn't know much most days." The fire crackled. A night insect somewhere behind them made its small, insistent sound. "I'm sorry," Alara said again. And again he didn't respond to it, and this time she understood why. There were certain losses that sat outside the reach of what condolences could touch, and telling a person you were sorry about them wasn't comfort so much as acknowledgement, and acknowledgement was what she was offering because it was what she had. "We should sleep," he said. "In shifts. I'll take first watch." She pulled her coat closer. The desert night was coming in fast, the way it does. The temperature dropping precipitously once the sun left, as if the warmth had been borrowed rather than real. She found the saddle blanket from the buckskin's pack and settled against the rock with it over her shoulders. "Maddox," she said. He looked at her. "The land office in Carver's Bluff," she said. "Those documents, what happens if Harlow gets there first?" He held her gaze. "Then we find another way," he said. "Is there another way?" A pause that was almost long enough to be an answer by itself. "There usually is," he said. "It's not always as clean." She thought about that. "He has a lot of men." "He has hired men," Maddox said. "That's different. Hired men have a calculus. When it stops being worth it, they recalculate." He looked at the fire. "The problem is reaching the point where they recalculate before they do too much damage." "And what's your calculus?" she asked. He considered it. Genuinely, she thought, not performing consideration, but actually taking the question seriously. "I've been at this for 2 years," he said. "I'm not walking away." "That's not a calculus. That's stubbornness." "Those two things look the same from outside," he said. She closed her eyes. The fire made heat against her face, and the rock at her back made cold. She heard him shift, settling into the watch, adjusting his position, his weight redistributing with the small sounds of a man who is prepared to be still for hours. In the distance, something moved in the scrub. Small, quick, gone. She thought about the auction block, the rope around her wrists, Doyle's ledger, the particular silence of a crowd that has decided to let a thing happen. She thought about her father, who had signed the papers with shaking hands and believed a calm voice. She thought about 460 acres on the eastern tributary, the smell of the grass there in early spring when the water ran, the specific way the light hit the ridge behind the house at sunset. She was going to get it back, all of it, every piece. She didn't know yet how the pieces fit together. The land office documents, the federal marshal in Carson Wells, the hired guns between here and the truth. She didn't know what the man sitting watch across that fire was fully capable of, or fully capable of keeping back. She didn't know who else in this territory might or might not be moved when the moment came, but she was going to get it back. She let herself think that thought all the way through before she slept. She woke before dawn to the sound of Maddox moving, not the alarmed movement of someone who'd heard something wrong, but the deliberate, quiet movement of a man shifting from watch to camp tasks, which was its own kind of reassurance. The fire had burned down to coals. The desert cold had settled in fully overnight, and she could feel it in her joints and in the bruise below her eye, which had stiffened while she slept and now reminded her of its presence every time she moved her jaw. She sat up. Maddox was crouched near the coals, feeding small sticks into them, with the patient economy of someone who understood that fire in this country was not a given. He didn't look up when she moved, but he spoke. "Coffee in 10 minutes, he said. "We need to be moving by first light." She stood and walked a distance from camp for privacy, and when she came back, he had the coffee ready and was already breaking down the bedroll with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing this long enough that packing a camp was no more thought-requiring than buttoning a coat. She drank the coffee standing, both hands around the cup, and let the heat work its way in. "Did you sleep?" she asked. "Some." "When?" 3 to 5, he said. Approximately. She'd slept through his watch change, which bothered her more than it probably should have. "You should have woken me." "You'd been standing in the sun without water for most of a day," he said. "You needed the hours more than I did." He said it without particular gentleness, just as a statement of operational fact, which was somehow easier to accept than if he'd been kind about it. They rode out as the sky was going from black to the dark blue that comes just ahead of dawn, the horses moving at a steady walk on the hard-packed trail north. The desert in that light had a quality it didn't have in the day, quieter, more dimensional, the shapes of rock and scrub given back their specificity by the cooler air. Alara had always liked this hour on the ranch. Her father used to say the day before sunrise was honest in a way it stopped being once the sun got going. She didn't know exactly what he'd meant by that, but she'd understood it anyway, which was how most of his wisdom had worked. She pushed that thought down and focused on the trail. "Tell me about Harlow's men," she said. "The ones he'll send." Maddox rode slightly ahead, the roan's hooves finding the path with authority. "He keeps a core group, 6, maybe 8 men who work directly for him, not the ranch hands. These are men he's hired specifically for situations like this one. Former military, some of them. Couple of bounty hunters." A pause. "There's a man named Cord Sable who runs the group. Big man, quiet, good tracker." "Have you had dealings with Sable before?" "We've been in proximity," Maddox said, which was not exactly an answer but conveyed something specific. "He's not reckless. He'll take his time and come at us with numbers rather than rush." "How much time does that buy us?" "Harlow got the news last night," he said. "Sable will have organized by this morning, and they'll know we went north. There's not many routes out of Black Hollow that don't funnel through predictable terrain. They'll be moving by now." He considered. "If we make Carver's Bluff before they catch up, we have options. Inside the town, there are limits to what even Harlow can do openly. He's careful about his image in places that have witnesses. Unlike Black Hollow." "Black Hollow has been his territory for 3 years," Maddox said. "He's had time to build the kind of presence that makes people forget they have options." He glanced back at her briefly. "Carver's Bluff is different. He does business there, but he doesn't own it." They made good time through the morning, the trail rising gradually as the land pushed north into higher, rougher country. The flat-topped buttes she'd seen yesterday gave way to broken mesa terrain, the rock faces striped in rust and yellow, and a pale cream color that the morning light turned almost white. It was harder country to move through, and harder country to be tracked in, which was presumably why Maddox had chosen it. Around mid-morning, the trail narrowed through a passage between 2 rock walls that came close enough together that they had to ride single file. Alara came through first, following Maddox, and on the other side the land opened into a shallow bowl with a stunted cluster of juniper at its center, and beyond that, a view of the terrain below and behind them that made her pull up her horse without thinking. She could see a long way south from here. The trail they'd ridden lay visible for several miles as a pale line through the darker scrub, and on that trail, moving north, were riders. "How many?" she said. Maddox had already stopped and was watching. He counted for a moment. 5, from what I can see. Could be more behind. He watched another moment. Moving fast. They're not tracking. They know the route. How do they know the route? Someone in Black Hollow told them, he said, with the flat effect of someone who isn't surprised by this. She looked at the riders below, tiny with distance, and thought about May Cutler's open shop and the dry goods store and the particular quality of silence that a town built on fear develops over time. She thought about how fear is not the same as loyalty, but produces the same behavior from the outside. We need to move, she said. Yes, he agreed. And they did. The pace shifted after that. Maddox pushed the horses harder, choosing a route that favored concealment over speed where the two conflicted, through draws, along the shadow sides of rock formations, avoiding the open ridgelines where they'd be visible. Alara matched him without complaint, though the buckskin was working harder than was comfortable, and the rough terrain was beginning to tell on both animals and riders. Her wrists had stopped being merely sore and were now consistently painful, and she was managing the reins in a slightly modified grip that kept the worst of it manageable. They stopped once, briefly, to walk the horses through a long stretch of loose rock that was too unstable to cross at pace. Walking was slower and exposed longer, but a horse with a broken leg in this country was a death sentence, and they both knew it. Alara walked beside the buckskin with her hand on the mare's neck and focused on the placement of each step. Maddox, she said. Yeah. When we reach Carver's Bluff and we find those documents, what exactly are we looking for? The original survey filings from when your father first registered the Quinn property, he said, picking his way carefully over a section of loose shale, and the original loan agreement that was filed with the land office before Harlow's people got to the secondary copies. The discrepancies between what's on file and what your father actually signed, that's the case. And who filed the originals? Was it my father? Your father filed the survey. The loan agreement was filed by the lender of record. He paused to steady the roan over a difficult step. The lender of record, officially, is a company called Territorial Development Associates. But if you pull that entity apart, and I've spent a significant amount of time doing exactly that, it traces back through 2 shell incorporations to Harlow Land and Cattle. She absorbed that. So Harlow lent my father money through a company that no one could immediately connect to Harlow, then used that loan to claim the land, and altered the terms of the loan document that your father received to make the interest rate and repayment schedule impossible to meet. He stepped over a last section of shale onto solid ground and stopped to let the roan find its footing fully. Your father received a document showing 15% interest with a 2-year term. The document on file at the land office, the original, shows 8% with a 5-year term. The alteration happened between what was filed and what was given to your father to sign. Harlow's lawyer handled the filing. The lawyer would be liable, Alara said. The lawyer left the territory 11 months ago, he said. I've been unable to establish where he went. She stood for a moment with her hand on the buckskin's neck and let the full shape of it settle. The deliberateness of it. The patience required to construct something like that. The shell company, the altered documents, the timing around her father's illness when he was least equipped to scrutinize the terms. The kind of plan that required not just money and power, but a particular willingness to look at a sick man's dying months and see opportunity in them. He's done this before, she said. Your father's property is the 7th I've documented, Maddox said. There are probably more. They remounted and pushed on. By early afternoon, the terrain had moderated and they were able to move faster again, covering ground with the urgent efficiency of people who have checked the distance behind them and found it insufficient. The horses were tiring, but not dangerously, but noticeably, the roan beginning to prefer a shorter stride and the buckskin's ears working more than usual, which Alara recognized as mild stress. She talked to the mare quietly when it came up, nothing elaborate, just a low and steady sound, and felt the ears slow their movement in response. You're good with horses, Maddox said once, without particular emphasis. I've been around them my whole life, she said. Not everyone who's around them is good with them. It was the closest thing to a compliment he'd offered. She didn't make a point of it, and neither did he. The trouble found them at a creek crossing in the mid-afternoon, a shallow, rocky creek that was easy enough to ford in normal circumstances, but which had a flat, open approach on either side that left them exposed for about 200 yards coming in and 200 going out. Maddox had pulled up on the near bank and was scanning the far side when Alara heard it, the particular sound of a horse on rock that was not the sound of their horses. "Left," she said. He'd already heard it. His right hand had moved to the revolver on that side with a naturalness that didn't look like a reach, and the roan had shifted under him as if reading the change in his posture. From behind a jutting rock formation about 150 yards upstream, a single rider came into view, stopped, and watched them. A moment later, a second rider appeared on the same side of the creek but downstream, then a third on the far bank, directly across. 3 visible. Alara did the arithmetic quickly. 5 riders spotted from the ridge, these 3 placed to cover the crossing, which meant 2 unaccounted for, which meant either flanking positions or a deliberate show of smaller numbers to push a reaction. "Don't reach for anything," Maddox said quietly. Not to her. His eyes were on the rider across the creek, the one who'd positioned himself to cut off the obvious forward route. "And don't talk." The rider across the creek was a large man on a gray horse. Even at this distance, Alara could see the deliberate, settled quality of how he sat, upright, unhurried, the posture of someone who is confident in the arrangement. This, she understood, was Cord Sable. Sable raised one hand in a gesture that might have been greeting and might have been instruction. "Maddox," he called across the water, his voice carried cleanly. "You've made this complicated." "I didn't make anything," Maddox said. His own voice was level and carried without apparent effort. "Harlow made this. I'm just reacting. You took something that belongs to Mr. Harlow." "I paid $110 for a free woman," Maddox said. "Whatever paperwork Harlow's got to the contrary, that transaction doesn't hold up." Sable's horse shifted and was stilled. "Mr. Harlow is willing to let you ride on," he said. "He has no particular interest in you, Maddox. His interest is in the girl." A pause. "Send her across and you go your way. That's a reasonable offer." "It's not," Maddox said. Alara felt her hands tighten on the reins and loosened them deliberately. The buckskin felt her tension and flicked one ear back toward her in inquiry. She kept her eyes moving. Upstream rider, downstream rider, Sable, the rocks and terrain behind and around each of them, the 2 positions she couldn't account for. The creek murmured over its stones between all of them, indifferent. "Think carefully," Sable said. "I have thought about it," Maddox said. "My answer's the same." He glanced at Alara with a brief, specific look that communicated something without words, or communicated several things, really, the primary one being that whatever happened next was going to happen fast, and she needed to be ready for it. His eyes cut briefly upstream, then back to her. She understood. Upstream rider was closest. If there was going to be movement, that was the direction it would open from. What happened next didn't happen fast, exactly. It happened with the particular compressed intensity of situations where a great deal of motion occurs in a very short span of time, but each piece of it is distinct and clear in memory afterward. The upstream rider moved first, not toward them but sideways, repositioning, which was the tell that a flanking move was in progress rather than a frontal approach, and which was also the tell that the 2 unaccounted-for riders were already in position somewhere Alara couldn't see. Maddox's revolver came up at the upstream rider with a smooth, unhurried arc that made the whole motion look slower than it was. The upstream rider pulled up hard. "Stop," Maddox said. Just the word, without additional volume. The rider stopped. Sable across the creek had not moved. He was watching with the analytical attention of someone running calculations. Alara understood, with the clarity that fear sometimes provides rather than always takes away, that Sable was determining whether the cost-benefit of a direct engagement was in his favor, and that the variable he was weighing was Maddox's capability, specifically whether the reputation was accurate. "This doesn't end here," Sable said, finally. "I know," Maddox said. "You're going to run out of terrain." "Probably," Maddox agreed. Another silence. The creek moved. Something wheeled high overhead in the pale sky. A hawk, or buzzard, too far up to tell. Then Sable backed his gray horse 2 careful steps and turned, and the downstream rider turned, and the upstream rider, After holding a moment longer than the others, making a point of it, turned as well. They didn't go far. Alara knew that. She could feel it in the way Maddox watched them go. The careful tracking of their movement without relaxing, without lowering the revolver fully until they were well out of range, and the terrain had given her something to watch beside them. "The two we didn't see," she said. "Still out there," he confirmed. Sable pulled back because a direct confrontation here has too many variables. He'll regroup and choose better ground. He finally holstered the revolver. His hand was steady. She looked specifically, and it was steady. She wasn't sure if that was training or temperament or some combination that had become indistinguishable. "We need to move differently from here." "How differently?" "We can't go directly to Carver's Bluff," he said. "That's the route they expect. We need to come at it from the north, which adds half a day." He looked at her. "The horses need rest. We push through tonight, rest before dawn, and come into Carver's Bluff from the north road in the morning." She looked at the creek, at the rocks where the riders had been and were no longer. "Sable's going to have men on the main road." "Yes," he said. "And on the north road?" "Possibly," he said. "Probably not yet. He has 5 men and 4 approaches to cover. He'll prioritize." He looked at her steadily. "It's not a good situation, but it's not a closed one." She nodded, pressed her heels gently to the buckskin sides, and moved into the creek crossing, the cold water moving over the mare's legs with a sound like a crowd whispering, and came out on the other side and kept going north. The half day they added was the longest half day she'd experienced since the week her father died. The terrain was punishing in the dark, requiring a pace that was slow enough to be safe for the horses, but fast enough to maintain the margin they needed, and the exhaustion that she'd been managing with structure and purpose started to seep through the structures as the hours accumulated. She didn't say anything about it. Maddox didn't ask, which she appreciated. She didn't want to be asked. She wanted to be moving, and he seemed to understand that without requiring it to be stated. They talked, some, not constantly. In the way people talk when they're both tired and covering ground, and conversation is as much about maintaining consciousness as about communication. She asked him where he was from originally. He said a place in the eastern part of the territory that didn't exist anymore, burned in a grass fire before the war, which was both an answer and not one. She asked if he'd always worked alone, and he said mostly, since Ben, which told her more about the quality of that loss than anything he'd said directly. She told him about the ranch, not the loss of it, but the thing itself when it was a going concern. The particular quality of work in the early morning when the air was still cool and the horses were fractious, and her father was always already up and had already made bad coffee and was cheerfully inflexible about the order in which things got done. She told him about the eastern tributary, the way it ran in spring and slowed to almost nothing in late summer and came back again, reliable in its unreliability, something you planned for. "You miss it," Maddox said. "It's still there," she said. "Harlow didn't burn it, he just put his name on it." She watched the trail ahead in the thin light. Names aren't permanent. Maddox rode for a while without responding. Then he said, "No, they're not." They reached the position he'd chosen for the rest stop around 3 in the morning, a shallow depression behind a long rock formation that blocked the north wind and provided enough cover to make a fire inadvisable, but a cold camp manageable. They watered and hobbled the horses, and Alara sat with her back against the rock and ate the last of the hardtack and some dried meat from the pack and didn't think about what she'd rather be eating because that was a thought with no useful end. "Get some sleep," Maddox said. "I'll take first watch this time," she said. He looked like he was going to argue. Then he looked at her and apparently decided not to. 2 hours, he said. "Then wake me." 2 hours, she agreed. He settled against the other end of the rock formation with his hat over his eyes and was still within a few minutes. Not asleep, she thought at first. But watching his breathing, she revised that. He was actually asleep, or close enough to it that the distinction didn't matter, which meant he trusted her watch enough to genuinely rest. She wasn't sure if that was a judgment about her specifically, or a judgment that any watch was better than none. But either way, she felt the weight of it, and sat with her back straight and her eyes on the terrain around them and kept it properly. In the distance, a coyote spoke and was answered and went quiet. The stars overhead were extraordinary, the kind of sky that requires total darkness to reveal itself. The kind that reminds you the world is much larger than whatever immediate problem is occupying your whole attention. She looked at it for a moment and allowed herself that, and then looked back at the terrain, because the stars were not going to notify her if Cord Sable's men came out of the dark. Carver's Bluff was hours away. The land office was in Carver's Bluff. The documents were in the land office, and somewhere behind them, patient and well-organized and not discouraged by one unsuccessful creekside conversation, Cord Sable was moving through the same dark night, recalculating. She turned up her collar against the wind and watched the dark. She woke Maddox at 5, as agreed, and slept for 90 minutes. That felt like nothing at all before he had her up and the horses ready and the cold camp packed with the silent efficiency that had become their shared language over the past 2 days. They rode into Carver's Bluff on the North Road as the morning was still deciding what it wanted to be, pale and gray, the town materializing out of it slowly, first as shapes and then as specific buildings, and then as a place with weight and mass and the smell of wood smoke and someone's early breakfast. Carver's Bluff was 3 times the size of Black Hollow, which was not saying a great deal, but it had the quality of a town that had decided to persist. There were 2-story buildings on the main street, a proper hotel with glass windows, a newspaper office with a press visible through the front window, a land office with painted letters on the door that listed the Territorial Registration Authority and its hours of operation. The streets had some traffic already. A freight wagon making an early delivery, a woman in a gray coat walking with the purpose of someone who had a list and intended to complete it, a dog investigating something under the boardwalk with the committed focus of dogs everywhere. Nobody looked at them with particular attention, which was what they needed. Land office opens at 8, Maddox said, reading the painted hours from across the street. We've got 40 minutes. Sable's men could already be in town, she said. Possibly, he said. Keep your hat down. She'd borrowed the hat, a plain, wide-brimmed thing from the saddlebag, the night before and had been wearing it pulled low since. It wasn't much of a disguise, but it changed the immediate silhouette. And in a town where nobody was specifically looking for her yet, that might be enough. They put the horses in the livery at the south end of the street, paying for 2 hours with coins Maddox produced from an interior coat pocket. The liveryman took the money without conversation and showed them the stalls without interest. Alara pulled the saddle off the buckskin herself and checked the mare's hooves while she had the chance. All 4 were fine, which was a relief that was more than practical, because she had become, over the past 2 days, genuinely concerned about this horse's well-being in a way that probably said something about where her emotional range was finding purchase. The land office was manned by a single clerk, a slight man in his 50s with ink-stained fingers and the resigned expression of someone who had been dealing with other people's paperwork for decades and had arrived at a complex peace with it. He unlocked the door at 8 on the dot and looked only mildly surprised to find 2 people waiting on his step. "Can I help you?" he said in the tone of someone for whom the question was professional rather than personal. "Survey filings and loan registrations," Maddox said. "Quinn property, Eastern Tributary, registered approximately 5 years ago, and Territorial Development Associates, any filings within the past 3 years. The clerk looked at him, then at Alara, then back at Maddox. "That's going to take some time to pull." "We have some time," Maddox said. They had, as it turned out, less time than they thought. The clerk found the survey filing inside 20 minutes. Thomas Quinn's original registration, neat and complete, with the property boundaries mapped in detail and the eastern tributary marked as a primary water source. He set it on the counter and went back for the loan documents while Alara stood over the survey and looked at it with her hands flat on the counter and the specific pain of seeing her father's handwriting in the signature block working its way through her chest in a way she didn't have space for right now. She focused on the content. The boundaries were as she remembered them. Everything was as Thomas Quinn had filed it, clean and unaltered, which was consistent with what Maddox had told her. Harlow's interference had been in the loan documents, not the survey. The clerk came back with a folder. Territorial Development Associates, loan registration on Quinn property. He opened it and set it on the counter beside the survey. And here's the original loan agreement, filed concurrently. Alara looked at the document, looked at the interest rate, 8%, 5-year term. Just as Maddox had said. The document that Harlow's lawyer had given her father to sign had said 15% in 2 years, She had seen it herself, standing beside her father's chair, trying to read over his shoulder while the calm-voiced lawyer explained that everything was in order. "I need copies of both of these," she said. The clerk looked at her. "Copies take time. We'll pay for expedited service," Maddox said, and put money on the counter, enough that the clerk's expression shifted from resignation to something more cooperative. "Give me 30 minutes," the clerk said. 22 minutes into the 30, the door opened. The man who came in was not Cord Sable. He was younger, with a heavy jaw and the double H stitched on his vest, and he came in with the specific energy of someone executing a task rather than making a choice, which meant he'd been sent and was following instructions and would report back. He looked at the counter. He looked at Alara. He looked at Maddox. He did the looking in that order, which told Alara that he'd been given a description of her and had been told she was the priority. He turned and went back out the door. "How long?" Alara said to the clerk. 8 more minutes." "Faster," Maddox said. He was already at the door, watching the street through the narrow window beside it. The clerk moved faster. His hands were not entirely steady, which Alara noted and couldn't fault him for. "How many?" she said to Maddox. "2 that I can see," he said. "The one who came in is talking to someone on the other side of the street. There'll be more coming." He turned from the window. His face had the particular quality it got when he was calculating. Not tense, exactly, but concentrated in a way that used all of him. "Alara." "I know," she said. "We can't go back the way we came." "I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him working through it. The routes, the numbers, the geography of Carver's Bluff and what it offered and what it didn't. Outside, the street continued its ordinary morning business, wholly unaware or pointedly pretending. "There's a different play," he said. She looked at him. "We've been running," he said. 2 days. And Sable keeps finding us because Harlow has resources we don't and time we can't match. Running to Carson Wells to find a federal marshal takes another 3 days minimum, and every one of those days is a day Harlow's men have to get in front of us." He stopped. "But Harlow's operating in this territory because nobody with standing has stood up and publicly named what he's doing. He's careful about appearances in towns that have witnesses. You said that yourself." "You said that," she said. "We need to give him a town full of witnesses," Maddox said. "We need to go back to Black Hollow." The clerk set the copies on the counter. Alara picked them up. She looked at the figures in her hands. 2 pieces of paper that set against each other told a story a court could understand. Then she looked at Maddox. "Harlow's home ground," she said. "His home ground is also where every person he's wronged is living," Maddox said. "Ranchers, miners, settlers. The people who watched your auction and said nothing. They said nothing because they're scared, not because they don't know what's happening. If they see it clearly enough, publicly enough, with enough people around that Harlow can't clean it up quietly, he'll still have his men," she said. "He'll still have Sable." "Yes," Maddox said. "That's the part of this plan that concerns me." "Me too," he said, which was honest enough to be worth something. She folded the copies and put them inside her coat, against her chest where they'd be hardest to get at. Outside, she could see 3 men now on the street, and the way they were positioned was not coincidental. "The back of this building," she said to the clerk. "Is there a door?" He pointed. They went out the back into an alley that smelled of ash and old water, and moved through it quickly with Maddox in front and Alara close behind, the documents against her ribs, her hand pressed over them through the fabric without thinking about it, the instinctive protection of something that mattered. The alley ran parallel to the main street for half a block, and then opened onto a cross street that was quieter, a residential stretch with a few modest houses and a lot of nothing else. They got to the livery without incident, which felt wrong, too clean, too easy. And the feeling proved accurate when they came through the livery door and found the liveryman standing at the back with his hands up and one of Harlow's men behind him with a revolver out. The man with the revolver looked at Maddox, and something went wrong in his expression. A fraction of a second of reassessment, the kind that happens when you've been told something about a person, and the person then materializes in front of you, and the reality and the description don't match up the way you expected. Maddox shot the revolver out of his hand. It was not a clean shot. The man screamed and fell back against the livery wall, and the liveryman dropped flat to the floor, with the good instincts of someone who understood immediately what was happening, and there was a crash as a bucket came down from somewhere, and horses in the back stalls began moving with alarmed agitation. The man with the injured hand was on the floor making sounds that were urgent and continuous, and Maddox stepped past him without stopping and reached the buckskin stall and was saddling the horse with the focused speed of someone who has had to saddle horses under pressure before. "Get yours," he said. Alara was already there. Her hands were shaking, not badly, but enough that the first buckle took 2 tries, which she made herself stop counting and just deal with. The roan was agitated from the noise and the smell of fear in the air, stomping and rolling his eyes, and Maddox worked around the horse's distress with the practiced patience of a man who needs the animal functional more than he needs it calm. "You," Maddox said to the liveryman, who had gotten to his knees. "North Road. Tell anyone who asks you saw us go south." The liveryman looked at him, looked at the man on the floor. "South," he said. "Yeah." "All right." They came out of the livery at a run and went east before the main street, cutting behind the row of buildings and through a gap between the newspaper office and a feed store, and came out on the far side of Carver's Bluff, where the road pointed back south and west, toward the territory they'd come from, toward the ground that Cord Sable knew and they were learning. They pushed the horses hard. Alara leaned low over the buckskin's neck and felt the mare extend into a genuine run, the back legs driving, the front end reaching, the ground coming up fast beneath them. And she felt the documents hard against her ribs with every stride and kept her hand pressed over them and rode. Behind them, she heard shouting, then nothing she could distinguish over the sound of hooves. They ran for a mile before Maddox slowed to a canter, and then a trot, the horses blowing hard but not spent. He looked back, nothing visible on the road behind them yet, though that was a temporary condition. "They'll figure out we didn't go south," she said. "In about 10 minutes, he agreed. "Maybe 15 if the liveryman takes his time." She straightened in the saddle and adjusted her grip on the reins. The documents were still there. She checked without taking them out, just pressing her hand against her coat and feeling the folded paper beneath. Still there. "Black Hollow," she said. "Black Hollow," he confirmed. She nodded. The road ran west through sparse desert scrub, and the sky above it was the same blank bone pale she'd been looking at for 2 days, and somewhere ahead of them, through Cord Sable's men and 2 days of hard riding and whatever Harlow had arranged in the meantime, was a town full of frightened people and one auction block and a cattle king who had built his empire on the assumption that the frightened people would stay that way. "I need you to tell me something," she said as they moved. "What?" "When we get there," she said, "when it's in front of all those people and Harlow tells his men to handle it, what's your actual plan for the part where they try to kill us?" Maddox looked at the road ahead. A long pause. "Create enough chaos in a public setting that Harlow loses control of it before he can contain it," he said. "People who are watching something happen in front of them, people who know the man being exposed, who have their own grievances with him. They stop being a crowd and start being something else." "You're betting on that," she said, "on people who already demonstrated they'll stay quiet." "I'm betting that there's a difference between quiet when you're alone with your fear and quiet when 50 people are all standing next to each other with the same fear," he said. "Fear alone keeps people separate. But when it's shared and visible and someone makes the first move," he stopped. "It changes." "Has that worked before?" she asked. "In your experience?" Another pause. "Once," he said, "and once it didn't." She appreciated that he didn't pretend the once it didn't wasn't there. "What happened when it didn't?" "People got hurt," he said. She rode for a while with that. The scrub moved past on both sides. A hawk circled something in the middle distance with the patient intensity of a hunter that is in no hurry because the prey has nowhere to go. "I'm still going back," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you not to." "I want to be clear that I'm not going because you suggested it," she said. "I'm going because it's the right play, and because that town watched me get sold, and nobody said a word, and I am not going to let that be the last thing that happened in Black Hollow." He looked at her sidelong. "Understood. And if it goes wrong, we deal with what we have," he said. "Same as the past 2 days." She thought about May Cutler, who had said one sentence and then closed her mouth. She thought about the ranchers and miners and settlers who lived in Harlow's shadow and had been living there long enough that it probably felt like weather, something you endure rather than something you fight. She thought about her father's handwriting in the survey filing, the careful loops of his letters, the signature that had been the start of the thing that destroyed him. She reached into her coat and felt the folded copies, pulled one out and looked at it. The loan document with its figures, 8%, 5 years, the terms her father had actually agreed to before someone changed them. Paper. Just paper. But the right paper, shown to enough people, in the right place at the right time. It had toppled things before. Not always. Not cleanly. But it had. "How long to Black Hollow from here?" she said, folding the document back and putting it away. "Day and a half if we push," he said. 2 if we're cautious. "We're not being cautious," she said. He said nothing to that. Just adjusted the roan's pace slightly and looked at the road ahead, and she matched him, and they rode west into the afternoon with the sun at their backs throwing long shadows in front of them on the pale dirt road, shadows that stretched ahead like something that had already arrived at the destination while the rest of them were still on the way. Somewhere behind them, Cord Sable was on the move again. She could feel it without seeing it, the same way you feel weather before it arrives. Not intuition exactly, but the accumulated reading of pattern and terrain and behavior. The understanding of how a man like Sable operates, and therefore where he would be and when. He would be faster this time. He'd know the destination. They needed to be faster than fast, and luckier than they had any right to count on, and they needed a town full of people to decide in the moment that enough was enough. Those were the pieces. None of them were guaranteed. All of them were necessary. She rode on. The documents pressed against her ribs with every stride of the buckskin beneath her, and she kept her hand there, and she did not let go. They came into Black Hollow from the east, which was the long way around and cost them 2 hours. But the main western approach would have had them riding through the open flat where Sable's men could see them coming from half a mile out and position accordingly. The eastern road came in through broken terrain, dry washes and rock formations that crowded the trail close and gave cover until almost the edge of town. Maddox had known about it. He'd scouted it on his way in 3 weeks ago when he was still just watching rather than moving, and Alara was beginning to understand that this was how he operated. Slowly at first, methodically, gathering the shape of a problem before committing to it. The problem now was that slow and methodical was behind them, and they were in the committed phase with no road back. They came into Black Hollow on a Saturday, which mattered. Saturday was market day. Ranchers and settlers from the surrounding territory rode in to trade and buy supplies and settle accounts, and Meridian Street had the particular busy quality of a place doing more business than usual. Wagons were pulled up along the storefronts. Horses were tied 3 and 4 deep at some hitching posts. The noise level was higher than a weekday. Voices, wheels, the sound of the feed store doing brisk work at the far end. More people than usual. Exactly what they needed, and exactly what made everything more dangerous. "Harlow's here," Maddox said quietly. They'd stopped just inside the eastern approach where the last rock formation gave them a partial screen. He was looking down Meridian Street with the focused attention he gave to everything that required assessment. "His horses are in front of the Territorial Bank, 4 of them, that brand on the saddlebags." Laura looked. He was right. He came himself. "He's been waiting," Maddox said. "He knew we'd come back here eventually, or he was afraid we would." He looked at her. A frightened man who has power is more dangerous than a confident one. "Is Harlow frightened?" "He came himself instead of sending Sable," he said. "That tells me something." She looked at the auction block at the far end of Meridian Street. It stood in the Saturday morning light the same way it always had, impassive, weathered, waiting. The sight of it went through her like something physical. She'd been trying not to look at it directly, and now that she had, she couldn't look away from it for a moment, and then she did, deliberately, and focused instead on the people moving along the street, the ranchers and settlers she didn't know by name, the people she did, May Cutler's dry goods store, which appeared to be open. 2 men she recognized from her father's occasional dealings in town, talking outside the harness shop. A woman with 2 children cutting across the street toward the bakery. People who had lives in this territory. People who had been living under Harlow's particular arrangement for long enough that they'd stopped thinking about whether the arrangement could change. The Territorial Bank, she said. That's where he conducts his business in Black Hollow? Meetings, contracts, the official face of things, Maddox said. He also has an arrangement with the bank manager, loans that Harlow's company backs, terms that favor Harlow's interests. The bank is where his legitimacy lives. She looked at the bank, then at the auction block, then at the distance between them, which was roughly the length of Meridian Street, maybe 200 yards, open, in front of every person doing their Saturday business. The biggest gathering Harlow ever has in Black Hollow is a Saturday market day, she said. Maddox looked at her. The plan was always the town's largest gathering, she said. This is it. It's happening right now. She put her hand against her coat over the documents. I don't want to wait for some orchestrated moment. He's already here, the people are already here, and Sable is somewhere behind us. A pause. If we go down that street, he said, there's no version of it where it stays quiet. It's not supposed to stay quiet, she said. That's the whole point. He looked at the street, looked at her. Something moved across his face that she couldn't fully read. Not doubt, not exactly, but the specific weight of a man who has done the calculation and arrived at an answer and is deciding whether he trusts the calculation. The bank first, he said, not the block. We go to where Harlow is and we bring the confrontation to him, not the other way around. Harder for his men to manage it if they're reacting. She nodded. They rode on to Meridian Street at a walk. The first people to notice were closest to the eastern end. A woman outside the general store who looked up and then looked again, and a man near the harness shop who straightened slowly with the deliberate stillness of someone trying to determine if what he was seeing was what he thought it was. Word moved the way it always moves in small towns, which is faster than it should be possible for word to move, not shouted, not announced, just passed from one set of eyes to another until the information had traveled the length of the street ahead of them. By the time they were halfway down Meridian, people had stopped moving. Not all of them, but enough that the ordinary flow of Saturday business had changed its character, become something else, a crowd in the process of forming. The door of the Territorial Bank opened. Harlow came out first, which surprised her. She'd expected him to send men, to stay back, to manage from a distance the way powerful men usually managed. But Vern Harlow was not that kind of powerful man, apparently. He was somewhere in his late 50s, shorter than she'd imagined from the scale of what he'd done, with a broad, square face and a neat white shirt and a jacket that had been cut by someone who knew what they were doing. He wore one gun, low on his right hip, and he wore it the way he wore the jacket, as an accessory to an image rather than as a primary tool. Behind him came two men in the double H vests. He saw Alara, and his face did something complicated and brief. Then it settled. "Miss Quinn," he said. He had a voice that had been cultivated for rooms, full and controlled, with the practiced authority of someone who had spent decades being the person whose voice carried farthest. "You've had quite a journey." She brought the buckskin to a stop about 30 feet from him. Maddox stopped beside her. The street around them had gone almost entirely still. Wagons stopped. Conversations halted. Saturday business suspended for something that had just become more compelling and more frightening than any transaction on offer. "Mr. Harlow," she said. She kept her voice level and let it carry, because the people who needed to hear this were not just the man in front of her. "I've come back to make something public." "This isn't the place for—" he started. "I've been to the land office in Carver's Bluff," she said, loud enough that it reached the people on the near side of the crowd. "I have documents. The original loan agreement filed by Territorial Development Associates, your company, registered through 2 shell incorporations but traceable to Harlow land and cattle, against my father's property." She reached into her coat and brought out the folded copies, held them up. "The original agreement shows 8% interest and a 5-year term. The document your lawyer brought my father to sign showed 15% in 2 years. Somebody changed those numbers between the filing and the signing." A sound moved through the crowd. Not words exactly. More like the collective sound of a large number of people absorbing something they already suspected and are hearing confirmed. Harlow's expression had moved from controlled to something with harder edges underneath. "Those are copies," he said. "You can't—" "The originals are in Carver's Bluff," she said. "Registered, filed, dated. Anyone who wants to look at them can look at them. The land office is a public record." "That's—" He stopped. "Started differently, with a different register, the boardroom authority setting aside. What you're doing right now is making accusations that have legal consequences, Miss Quinn. I'd advise you to think carefully." "I've thought carefully," she said. "I've been thinking carefully for 3 days on very bad roads." She looked past him at the people on either side of the street, the ranchers and settlers and miners and storekeepers, the people who had watched from the sidewalk when she was brought down this same street with her hands tied. "How many of you have done business with Territorial Development Associates?" she said to them, to all of them. "How many of you have had loans from them that felt like they changed terms on you? How many have lost land in the past 3 years to Harlow's company on the basis of a debt you don't fully understand?" Silence. The particular silence of people who are afraid to be the first one to speak. Then a man near the hardware store said, "My neighbor lost his place last spring." He said it quietly, but the street was quiet enough that it carried. 60 acres on the north tributary. He said the terms weren't what he agreed to. Harlow turned his head toward the voice. The man who'd spoken didn't look away, which took something. "And the Beaumont family," said someone on the other side of the street. A woman's voice. 3 years ago." "My father-in-law," said someone else. Harlow's jaw had tightened. His 2 men had shifted, both of them scanning the crowd with the heightened attention of people who are beginning to count numbers and not liking the count. "This is fabricated," Harlow said, and there was something in his voice now that had not been there before. Not quite fear, but the thing that exists just before fear, the recognition that a situation is not behaving as expected. "She's a woman with a grievance and a piece of paper she got from somewhere, and no legal standing to—" "She has standing," said May Cutler. Every head turned. May Cutler was standing in the doorway of her dry goods store, arms crossed, with the expression of someone who has been carrying a decision for a long time and has finally put it down. "Her father's property was taken from him by fraud," she said. "I knew Thomas Quinn for 12 years. He was not a man who misread a contract." Harlow stared at her. "And I know 3 other families in this territory who will say the same thing about their own contracts with your company," May said. "I've known it for 2 years and said nothing, and I'm not—" Her voice caught briefly and steadied. "I'm not doing that anymore." The thing that happened then was not a roar. It was not a dramatic uprising of the kind that stories sometimes described. It was quieter than that, and more human. It was the sound of a large number of people simultaneously deciding, each one individually, that the cost of staying quiet had just exceeded the cost of speaking, and the sound of all those individual decisions landing at nearly the same moment. It sounded like a crowd clearing its throat, like a shift in air pressure. Harlow said something to his 2 men that Alara couldn't hear. The 2 men started forward. Maddox moved the roan between them and the crowd with a single, specific movement, not blocking Harlow's men from the crowd, but blocking them from Alara, which changed the geometry of the situation in a way that made both of them pull up. "You want to be careful here," Maddox said. He said it quietly, for the men specifically rather than the crowd, and something in the quiet of it reached them in a way that a louder statement might not have. The closer of the 2 men was looking at him with an expression that was doing rapid internal math. "Think about what you're being paid," Maddox said. "Then think about what you're about to step into." The second man looked at his colleague. Something passed between them. Not words, just a look, the kind of rapid renegotiation that Maddox had described at the creekside 2 days ago. When it stops being worth it, they recalculate. The first man took a step back. The second, after a moment that felt longer than it was, did the same. Harlow noticed. His face went through something ugly. "This is not over," he said, loud enough for the street. "This woman has stolen documents and made fraudulent accusations, and there will be legal—" "Mr. Harlow." The voice came from behind the crowd, from the eastern end of Meridian Street, and it had an authority in it that was different from Harlow's practiced boardroom projection, quieter and harder. and belonging to a man who didn't need volume because the badge on his coat did that work for him. The crowd parted in the instinctive way crowds part for certain kinds of arrival. Marshal Dean Holt of Carson Wells was not a large man. He was perhaps 50, with a weathered face and a gray mustache and the general appearance of someone who had seen a great many things and had arrived at a position on most of them. He rode a pale horse, and he rode it into the space the crowd had made for him, and stopped there and looked at the scene in front of him with the methodical attention of a man conducting an assessment. "I've been riding for 2 days," he said. He looked at Alara, then at Harlow, then at the documents in Alara's hand. "Miss Quinn, is that right?" "Yes," she said. "I received a message 3 days ago from a man named Maddox suggesting I should come to Black Hollow on a matter of territorial fraud," he said. He glanced at Maddox. "You're harder to reach than advertised." "It's been a complicated few days," Maddox said. Alara stared at him. He didn't look at her, which told her he'd known she would stare. "You sent for him," she said. "Before the auction," he said. "From Black Hollow. I didn't know if he'd come or how long it would take." He paused. "I didn't want to tell you in case he didn't." She thought about what to do with that information and decided to do nothing with it right now because Marshal Holt was dismounting and walking toward Harlow with the deliberate pace of a man who has made up his mind before he started moving. "Vern Harlow," Holt said, "I'm going to need you to come with me, and I'm going to need to look at every piece of paper in that bank office that has your company's name on it." He stopped a few feet from Harlow. "And if I find what I expect I'm going to find, we're going to be making a long ride to the federal courthouse in the morning." Harlow looked at the marshal, looked at the crowd, looked at his 2 men, who were already the kind of irrelevant that men become when the mathematics of a situation have moved past them. The double H on those vests seemed in that moment to shrink. "I want a lawyer," Harlow said. "You'll have one," Holt said. "That's how it works." He nodded to a deputy who had ridden in behind him and was already moving toward Harlow. "Let's go." What Alara remembered afterward about the moment Harlow was walked into the bank, his own bank, to be searched by a federal marshal, was not satisfaction. She'd expected satisfaction, and what she got instead was something flatter and more complicated, a kind of exhaustion, the specific variety that settles in when something you've been bracing for finally arrives. She sat on the buckskin in the middle of Meridian Street with the documents still in her hand and the crowd still around her and let the exhaustion be there for a moment. May Cutler came off the boardwalk and walked toward her. "You all right?" May said. She stopped beside the buckskin and looked up with an expression that had the self-consciousness of someone who knows they owe an accounting. "Not entirely," Alara said, "but working on it." May's mouth pressed together. "I should have spoken sooner." "Yes," Alara said, because May deserved the truth of that rather than a softening of it. "You should have." May nodded, absorbed it. "What do you need?" Alara looked at the street, at the ranchers and settlers who were talking now, not quietly, not cautiously, but with the energy of people who have been holding something back for a long time and have suddenly been given permission to stop. At the hardware store, where the man who'd spoken first was now at the center of a cluster of other men, all of them talking with their hands. At Maddox, who had moved the roan to the side of the street and dismounted and was standing beside the horse with his hat in his hands, looking at the ground with the expression of a man who is taking a breath after something difficult. "I need water," she said, "and food, and somewhere to sit that isn't a horse." She paused. "And then I need to talk to Marshal Holt about 6 other families who lost land the same way my father did." May Cutler looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Come on then," and turned toward the dry goods store, and Alara swung down from the buckskin, and her legs nearly gave on the landing. 2 days and more of riding had collected itself in her joints, and she caught herself on the stirrup and stood straight and followed. The trial, when it came, took months to arrange and more months to complete. That was the nature of these things. Not clean, not quick, not the sharp resolution that the moment in the street had seemed to promise. Harlow's lawyers were effective, and the proceedings were complicated by the jurisdictional questions that always complicated territorial cases. And there were delays and counterfilings, and 2 attempts by Harlow's remaining allies to suppress the land office records from Carver's Bluff, both of which failed. But they failed. That was the thing. The documents held. The originals in the Carver's Bluff land office held up against every challenge Harlow's legal team mounted, because paper doesn't have interests and doesn't get frightened and doesn't recalculate. It just says what it says, in the figures and dates and signatures that were there before anyone tried to change them. The trial concluded on a Tuesday in late autumn when the territory had gone cold and the sky had the high, clear quality it gets in that season. Harlow was convicted on 7 counts of deed fraud, 2 counts of loan document falsification, and 1 count of criminal conspiracy. His lawyers had kept the sentence from being longer than it was, but it was long enough. His empire in the territory went into receivership within weeks of the conviction, his holdings frozen and then systematically examined, and the process of identifying what had been taken from whom and returning it was complicated and imperfect and slow. There was an arbitration board appointed by the federal court that worked through the cases one at a time. The Quinn property took 11 weeks to formally transfer back. Alara had spent most of those 11 weeks on the ranch anyway. The new occupants Harlow had installed had left when the receivership started, and the land didn't wait for paperwork. The first thing Alara did when the land was formally returned was fix the fence line on the north pasture, which had been cut in 3 places by Harlow's people and left that way. It was not a symbolic act. It was a practical one. Cattle from the neighboring property had been drifting through the gaps for weeks, and the grass on the Quinn side was suffering for it. She spent 2 days on the repair with borrowed wire, and her own hands, working from the eastern corner inward, resetting posts that had been pulled loose and stringing new line where the old had been taken entirely. Her hands looked different when she finished than they had before her father died. The rope marks had long since faded, but there was a callus on the inside of her right thumb that hadn't been there a year ago, and a small scar on her left palm from a wire slip on the second day of fencing that she'd wrapped in cloth and kept working through because the fence wasn't going to finish itself. She noticed these things the way you notice changes in a place you've been away from, not with surprise exactly, but with the specific attention that absence makes possible. The ranch itself was in worse shape than the fence. Harlow's occupants hadn't abused it deliberately, but they'd had no investment in it, and it showed. Deferred maintenance accumulated the way it always does when nobody cares enough to stay ahead of it. The roof of the main barn needed 2 sections replaced. The irrigation channel from the eastern tributary had partially silted up from a season of neglect and needed clearing before spring. The house had been left with a broken window in the kitchen that someone had covered with board and then not replaced, and the board had warped in the autumn rain, and now the kitchen was cold in a way it hadn't been designed to be. Alara made a list. She had always made lists, say it was a habit from her father, who believed that an unwritten task was a task that would not get done, a conviction she'd argued with as a teenager and had arrived at, eventually, as an adult truth. The list was long. She looked at it over coffee one morning in late October, sitting at the kitchen table in her coat because of the warped board over the window, and felt the full weight of what had been taken and what it was going to require to get back. She also felt, underneath that weight, something she hadn't let herself feel in a long time, something that had no name more precise than, "This is mine, and I am here, and I am going to make it work." That feeling was not triumphant. It was tired and practical and quietly determined, which was maybe the only version of it that was actually sustainable. Maddox had stayed in the territory through the trial. She hadn't asked him to, and he hadn't announced it. He'd simply remained, the way a piece of weather sometimes remains past its expected duration, present without explanation. He'd taken a room at the boarding house in Black Hollow and had appeared periodically in ways that were useful without being intrusive. Once with a load of fence wire in the back of a borrowed wagon, once to help clear the irrigation channel when it became clear the silt was deeper than she could manage alone. Once simply riding by on the road past the north pasture while she was working and stopping for long enough to ask if she needed anything, and accepting "not right now" without discussion. She thought about this pattern one evening while she was sitting on the porch of the ranch house watching the last light work on the ridge behind the property. The specific way it hit in autumn, lower and longer than summer, turning the rocks from rust to something closer to gold before the cold came in. Her father used to sit in this same spot for this same reason. She'd always thought it was an old man's habit, watching light move on rocks. She understood it better now. Maddox rode up the track about 20 minutes into the watching. He tied the roan to the porch rail and came up the steps without being invited, which she'd stopped minding a while ago, and sat in the other chair, her father's chair, the one with the uneven leg that always needed a shim under it, and looked at the ridge. They sat for a while. The arbitration board finished the Beaumont case, he said eventually. Their property transfers back next week. May told me, she said. And the Garfield family east of town, Marshall Holt called it settled this morning. That's 6 of the 7. The 7th is the price claim, Maddox said. The documentation on that one is more complicated. Harlow's people were thorough about covering the price transaction. I know, she said. I've been working with their son on what they have. There may be a way through it if the original survey maps can be located. She paused. I wrote to the territorial surveyor's office in the capital, waiting to hear back. He looked at her. She could see it in her peripheral vision without turning her head. You've been doing this since before the trial was done, he said. Not a question. The other families were my witnesses, she said. Without them, the case against Harlow was one woman with 2 pieces of paper. Their testimony about their own experiences is a large part of why the conviction held. She watched the light on the ridge complete its movement into shadow. That means something. You don't take something like that from people you don't just go back to fixing your own fence. He was quiet for a moment. You could have. I know. Most people would. I know that too, she said. She finally turned her head and looked at him directly. Is that what you expected me to do? He held her gaze. No, he said. I didn't expect that from you. Then why bring it up? A pause. A slight shift in his expression that might have been, in different light or from a different angle, something close to a smile. Not full, not warm exactly, but there. Because most people would, he said, and the fact that you're not most people keeps surprising me, even when I know it shouldn't. She looked back at the ridge. You could help with the price claim, she said. You know how to read Harlow's shell company documents. You know the structure of how he buried the transactions. The price case is going to need that. Silence. I'm not asking you to stay, she said. I'm asking if you want to do useful work. Those are different things, he said. Yes. More silence. The last of the light left the ridge and the rocks went the uniform dark of evening, the shapes remaining after the color did not. A coyote somewhere to the north made its brief, businesslike announcement and received no answer. Ben is better, Maddox said. She turned her head. The hospital wrote to me last week, he said. He's had 2 months in a row of, they described it as increased lucidity. He recognized a nurse he'd known for a year, which apparently he hadn't been doing. He said it carefully, the way you carry something fragile. They don't know if it holds. They said they can't predict that. He looked at his hands. But he's better. That's good news, she said. Yeah. He sat with it for a moment. I've been trying to figure out what to do with it, whether to go see him, whether seeing me helps, or... He stopped. He always felt guilty that I came after him, that I got pulled into Harlow's business because of his situation. I don't know if me being there reminds him of that. You should go, she said. Whatever he feels about it, you should go. He looked at her. Guilt and love are not the same thing, she said. He might feel both. He can feel both and still need to see his brother. She paused. Go, and then come back if you want to help with the price claim. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, You're not worried I won't come back? I'm not worried, she confirmed. Most people? Maddox, she said. You sent for a federal marshal 3 weeks before you knew if any of it would work. You paid $110 for someone you'd never met. You spent 2 years on something most people would have walked away from in 2 months. She looked at him steadily. You're not the kind of person who doesn't come back. He looked away first. Out at the dark ridge and the darkening sky above it, the stars beginning their slow appearance at the east end of the sky, the way they always began. 1, then 3, then more than you could track individually. The money, for what it's worth, he said. I want it noted that I was not expecting the situation to turn into what it turned into. The $110. I expected to cut someone loose and ride away, he said. It was supposed to be a clean thing. She laughed. Came out before she decided to let it. A genuine sound, short, surprised, out of her. Nothing in this has been clean, she said. No, he agreed. It has not. The night settled fully around the porch, and the cold came with it the way autumn cold comes in this country, dropping fast once the sun was gone, so that the difference between sunset and full night was 20 degrees in a different world. Alara pulled her coat tighter and thought about the kitchen window with its warped board and the cold that came through it and the glazier in Black Hollow she'd been meaning to call on, and about the fence on the north pasture that was fixed and the silt in the irrigation channel that was cleared and the list on the kitchen table that was long but had items crossed off it now. She thought about May Cutler, who had said one sentence at an auction and then spent 6 months being a critical witness in a fraud case and had not apologized again for the time in between, which Alara had come to respect as the correct approach. You couldn't undo the silence. You could decide what came after it. She thought about Marshall Holt, who had ridden 2 days on the strength of a message from a man he'd never met and had arrived in time to be exactly what the moment required, and who had told her afterward, over coffee in May's store, that he'd been watching Harlow's territory for a year but had never had the specific documentation he needed to move on it. Sometimes, he'd said, all it takes is someone deciding they're done being afraid, and the rest of it follows. She'd thought about that sentence a lot since. It was not entirely true. Being done with fear didn't, by itself, build a case, or change a jury, or return a deed. It required all of the other things, too. The right documents, and the right witnesses, and the right moment, and a fair amount of luck about the timing. But it was also not entirely untrue, because without that decision, none of the other things got started. Fear is not broken by courage as a single event. It breaks slowly, in pieces. And the pieces are small and practical, and repeated until the total weight of them exceeds the weight of the fear. She knew that now in a way she hadn't known it a year ago. She'd known it intellectually. Her father had told her versions of it, but knowing something intellectually and knowing it because you have been through the specific experience that teaches it are different kinds of knowledge, the kind she had now sat in her hands and her back, and the scar on her left palm and the callus on her right thumb. It was not comfortable knowledge. It also did not leave. You know what I keep thinking about, she said. Maddox, who had been quiet long enough that she'd thought he might have drifted into something close to sleep, turned his head. What? The auction block, she said. It's still there, at the end of Meridian Street. She'd walked past it several times since returning to Black Hollow. It hadn't been dismantled or moved, just left there in the ordinary way that things are left when no one has specifically decided to deal with them. I asked May what she thought should happen to it. She said she thought it should come down, that it had no useful purpose anymore. Alara paused. I disagreed. What did you say to her? I said, leave it standing, she said, not as a monument to what happened on it, not as a celebration of anything, just leave it there so people remember it's possible, that a town can let something like that happen when it's afraid enough, that no amount of ordinary good behavior before or after changes the fact that it happened. She looked at the dark sky. Forgetting it is more dangerous than looking at it. Maddox was quiet. My father used to say that the frontier was a place where you made yourself from nothing, she said. That was the romance of it, that you could arrive with nothing and build something. And that's true, I think, but what he didn't say, what nobody says in those stories, is that it also works the other way. You can arrive with something and lose it, not because you failed, but because someone with more power decided they wanted it. The frontier gives and the frontier takes, and the taking is not always earned. She paused. What Harlow did was not an anomaly. It's a thing that will happen again, somewhere, to someone, because power does what power does when there are no structures to hold it accountable. The only real protection is people who know how to name what they're seeing and refuse to stay quiet about it. You're going to run for something, Maddox said. She looked at him. He said it with the flat effect he used for things he'd already concluded, not predictions so much as recognitions. Not run for something, she said. The arbitration board that handled the land cases, Marshall Holt asked if I'd be willing to serve as a civilian advocate on the appeals panel. Cases where families are contesting land decisions and don't have legal representation. She looked at her hands in the dark. I said yes. He nodded slowly. You'll be good at it. I'll be difficult at it, she said. I'll ask too many questions and I'll trust the documentation more than I trust the testimony of men with nice suits. She paused. But yes, I think I'll be effective. Same thing, in this work. She thought he was right about that. The night had gone fully cold and the stars were out in numbers now, the whole spread of them, the sky doing the thing it did out here that it couldn't do in cities, becoming its actual self, the enormous and indifferent and somehow companionable dark with its ancient light scattered across it. She'd grown up under this sky, and she still wasn't used to it, which was maybe the correct relationship to have with it. Maddox stood from the chair, the one with the uneven leg, and it shifted under him as he rose, the familiar tilt of it, and he steadied it automatically with one hand in the way you steady something without thinking. He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the rail. "I'll go see Ben," he said. "Good. I don't know how long it'll take." "Take what it takes," she said. He looked at her for a moment. In the dark and the starlight, he was difficult to read, which was not entirely different from how he was in daylight. But there was something in the look that was unguarded in a way she'd seen from him rarely and always briefly, the way a person looks when they want to say something and haven't found the right version of it. "You're going to be all right," he said finally. It was not the thing she'd expected him to say, if she'd expected anything. She thought about it, about what it meant coming from him specifically, a man who chose his words the way he chose routes through difficult terrain, not for elegance, but for accuracy. "I know," she said. "I know you know," he said. "I'm saying it anyway." He went down the steps and untied the roan and mounted without difficulty, the horse shifting to accept his weight with the familiarity of a long partnership. He turned the horse toward the track and looked back once. "The price survey maps," he said. "Check the county repository in Larson County. Harlow's company had dealings there, and they sometimes filed copies of disputed surveys to establish priority. If there's an original price survey anywhere, it'd be there." She stared at him. "You already looked into this." "I had some time," he said. "Maddox, Larson County Repository," he said. "Tuesday through Friday, 9 to 4. He turned the roan and rode down the track into the dark, the sound of the horse's hooves on the packed earth fading with distance, and then the quiet of the ranch settling back around her, the small sounds of animals in the near pasture, the wind in the dried grass beyond the fence line, the creek moving over its stones somewhere in the dark below the ridge. Alara sat on the porch for a while longer. The cold was serious now, and she should go in, and she would go in, and she would make a note about the Larson County Repository and add it to the list on the kitchen table below all the other items. But first she let herself sit for a moment with the full shape of the past year. Not to dwell in it, not to relive the worst of it, but in the way you take stock after something large has moved through your life. You assess the damage, and you assess what held. You figure out what you're working with going forward. What she had. 460 acres returned to their rightful ownership. A fence that was fixed. An irrigation channel that was clear. A list that was long but getting shorter. 6 families whose land had been given back, and a 7th that wasn't finished yet, but was going to be finished. A town that had found its voice again, imperfectly and late, and with full knowledge of the cost of the lateness, but found it. A position on an appeals panel that was going to require her to be difficult and thorough and relentless about documentation, and she was going to be all 3. What she'd lost, her father, who had signed a paper with shaking hands and trusted a calm voice, and died believing he'd made a mistake that couldn't be corrected. He'd been wrong about the second part. She wished she'd had the chance to tell him. She was going to have to settle for knowing it herself, which was a kind of closure that wasn't entirely satisfying and was also the only kind available, which was true of most kinds of closure if you looked at them honestly. What she'd learned, that justice is not a thing that arrives. It is a thing that is built, piece by piece, out of paperwork and stubbornness and the willingness of enough people to stop staying quiet at the same moment. It does not arrive clean. It is always late. It costs more than it should. But it is buildable, and the building of it is not heroic work. It is grinding, repetitive, mundane work, the same work over and over in slightly different configurations, and the people who do it are not special, so much as they are willing to keep doing it when it would be easier to stop. She had not known that a year ago. She knew it now. The cold pushed in against her coat, and she let it push for another minute, looking at the stars over the ridge that her father used to look at, in the chair that she had always thought of as his chair, and was now simply a chair on her porch. The light up there was old. She'd learned that once, somewhere, that what you were seeing when you looked at stars was light that had left its source centuries or millennia before and was only now completing its journey. You were never seeing the star as it was. You were seeing it as it had been, the light of something that might not even exist anymore, traveling through all that dark to arrive here, to this porch, to these eyes. She stood, went inside, pulled the board off the kitchen window frame and set it by the door to remind herself to call the glazier in the morning and let the cold come fully in, and started a fire in the kitchen stove because she was going to be warm in this house, even if it was drafty, and put the kettle on and sat at the table with her list and a pencil and added Larson County Repository, Tuesday to Friday, 9 to 4 to the bottom. Then she crossed off fix north fence and clear irrigation channel and talked to arbitration board because those were done, and looked at what remained and thought about the Price family's son, a young man of 22 who had been working someone else's land for a year because his family's land had been taken from them, and who had come to her 3 weeks ago with a box of his father's papers and the particular look of someone who has decided to try one more time before giving up entirely. She knew that look. She'd worn it herself. She picked up the pencil and started working. Outside, the wind moved through the grass on the Quinn Ranch, the eastern tributary running quiet in the dark below the ridge, the fixed fence holding along the north pasture, the barn with its 2 new roof sections silver in the starlight. 460 acres of imperfect, difficult, beautiful land, sitting in the dark the way land sits, patient, without memory, without grievance, simply waiting for whoever was willing to tend it. Alara Quinn was willing. She had always been willing. She just hadn't known, until the year that tried to take everything from her, quite how much.